from The Diary of a Nose. And it's written by Jean-Claude Elena, who was the in-house perfumer at Hermes. So he's sort of one of my perfume idols. And I'm just going to read about a page and a half from this, and then lead into what we'll be talking about today, which is the Rothko series. Cool. Okay. The Dream Perfume. I am continuing this diary daily during the holidays in the light-hearted spirit of a summer magazine. I have never had the question. I am of the light-hearted spirit of a summer magazine. I have never answered the question, what would be your dream perfume? For a time, I could never get a clear answer to this, but I will try today. The dream perfume is one that can be smelt and experienced in the moment, for the time of one inhalation, but not one to be worn. It is not an ornament or an item of clothing, nor is it a protection. It is pure emotion. This concept might be confusing because imagining a perfume in this way takes us outside its usual codes. I dream up a perfume as a poetic offering, a sudden ravishing delight of unpredictability. In the words of haiku writers who reveal the unknown at the heart of everything familiar, I came close to this dream in Japan when I took part in a kodo ceremony. These complex ceremonies involving perfume and incense can take many different forms. During this one, the master of ceremonies burned 10 different fragrances after another. For each one, the participants were invited to compose a poem and to hand their writings to the master of ceremonies. All the poems were read by him, and those attending were asked to choose the poem that best evoked the perfume. The winner was whoever was selected the most often. The ceremony followed a slow and precise coded ritual, despite the discomfort of sitting cross-legged on the tatami for more than 2 hours. I found this meshing of poetry and smells generating a feeling inside me of completeness and harmony, an experience shared by most of the participants. The dream can take another form. I sometimes think I should go back to some of my perfumes and rewrite them. I do not mean starting them with the same theme and creating a new perfume, which is already something I have done on the idea of tea, for example, but rather to have a similar approach to making a new translation of a book, staying as close as possible to the original perfume, but writing it in other words, smells. That might translate the idea I have of the perfume. The way in which we read and perceive a book is not exactly the same today as it was yesterday, and the same can be said of perfume. Chanel's rewriting of Chanel No. 5 with Eau Première was an interesting way of interpreting this idea. If I pursue a similar dream, though, I am not sure I will find any answers. Anyway, we got through that in the end. Thank you very much for listening to that. I really love that passage. Again, for anyone who's tuned in who's confused why I'm doing this on my personal page, I'm just gonna, it won't let me stream on Sonic Alchemy, so I'm going to post this up to Sonic Alchemy when it's done. So if you're watching on the Sonic Alchemy page once it's done, thank you so much for watching. Cool, so I thought I'd add like a slightly different element to the talks today and for the future talks as well. It's going to be called Smell and Tell, or Show and Smell, sort of like show and tell but with scent. So every week from now on, I'm going to bring in a single ingredient that I've used in perfumes, and I'm going to smell it and describe it to you and give you some context about how it's used and why it's used and that kind of thing. So today I'm going to show you one. This is sort of hard to see, if you can kind of see it. Not really. Kinda. It's called cis-3-hexanol, which is a big chemical name for essentially the smell of cut grass. It's in perfume, for example, an essential oil from something like rose or jasmine contains sort of anywhere between 200 and 800 different molecular components. That's why a lot of these natural scents smell so rich and complex. It's because they have many different parts and components that you're smelling all at one time, and a lot of them are sort of imperceptible, and the cool thing about cis-3-hexanol is that it is actually one molecule. So you have something like rose oil, which has 400 molecules in it, thereabouts, or aroma components, whereas this is just one. So in perfume, we smell using these little scent strips. So I'm gonna smell this fellow and describe it a little bit. Cis-3-hexanol, although it's a synthetic, meaning it's made in the lab, it is found throughout nature, really sort of generously throughout nature. It has this amazing smell of during spring, when the new grass grows after the cold winters. It has this amazing sort of way of evoking that time as summer sort of rears its head during the middle of spring in Canberra, when people start to mow their lawns sort of regularly. It is, it's also found in sort of fruity smells, so pear and green apple and banana. When we work with this material, we actually dilute it down to sometimes less than 1%, which I'll talk about how that works a little later, maybe in a different video. But I'm smelling this at 1% concentration, so it's 100 times less powerful than the pure product. When you smell it pure, it actually smells a lot like a very unripe banana. It's incredibly intense to smell it pure, but when you get it as a weaker smell, you dilute it down, you get these amazing facets of kind of that crumpled leaf and beautiful different kind of grassy scents. I use this material a lot, and it's because you can do a great number of things with very simple materials. So you might have something like this ingredient that smells of green grass, but you can sort of transpose and manipulate the scent of it to evoke morning dew on a sports field, or it can be, you can make it more hay-like and drier, and sort of the smell of grass during a drought. It's not as if there's one cut grass smell. There's the basic idea of it, and then how you stylize it and how you make it tell the truth of a moment is sort of its essence, I think. That's one way of explaining it. So cis-3-hexanol is a good way to start the smell and tell. And it's in one of the perfumes that we're going to be talking about today, which is my perfume called Ira. So last week I said I would print off some of these paintings that we're going to talk about and show them to you. So first off, we're going to finish our discussion on the Rothko series, which I spoke about last week. when we went through Blue and Monolithic. I'm going to share a link for anyone who is watching to my actual online site thingy of Ira, so that you can, if you'd like to read, I believe I've gotten that right, yeah. So that if you'd like to, you can read the actual scent description for that, which I've linked in the comments here, should be down there. Cool, yep, there it is. So Ira is a perfume that I've created. The lighting in here is somewhat odd because it's about to rain here in Canberra, I think. And this is the painting that the perfume is based on. It has a green center, which it's hard to tell, but it actually, on this side, it actually gets black, goes from green to black, which I think is quite a common color combination in a lot of painting. And then it has this white grayish outline underneath here with the big rectangular yellowy part here. And inside the yellowy part, he's mixed a little bit of green as well, so it corresponds with the top green. Although you won't be able to see it very clearly here, there's also where my left finger is, there's this outline of sort of ochre. It's like a sort of an earthy brown kind of thing. He's finished the outline with. This is a very interesting sort of example of how scent and painting can go together, because what I've done here is essentially each section, even the small white and the outline parts, they all are represented separately inside the perfume Ira. I'm going to talk a little bit about perfume structure to make this sort of make a little bit more sense. So in perfume, at least the way that I was trained and the way that I do it, is I have the heart note, which in the case of Ira is this green section here. We have the top note, or what I call the modifiers, which is the white section here. And then I guess you could say it's we usually would call it the blenders, but to simplify things, it's like the secondary heart note, which is the yellow section here. And then the base note, which is the longest lasting part of the perfume, containing the heaviest ingredients, usually things like wood and moss and musk and amber, and heavy smells that linger, is actually the outlining brown section, sort of almost at the back of the painting. So I've actually sort of physically modeled the aesthetic form, the actual, the kind of, the build of the perfume, like the modeling of Ira as a scent, on the actual way that the painting has been structured. So with that in mind, and in another video, I'll go a little bit more in depth about how that structure works. But for now, we'll just say that each section of the painting has its own reflective part in the perfume. So, and again, when I talk about the perfumes that we'll be talking about today, I don't have a formula in front of me, and I haven't re-looked at any of the formulas. So I'm trying to set this challenge for myself, where I'll talk about the perfumes off by heart. I think that's a really, really good, important thing for a perfumer and for an artist to do. I spoke about it a bit in the previous video, but it's kind of a nice way of understanding how the whole thing moves together, to talk about it by heart, I guess. So with that in mind, the way that I have brought this sort of green, dark, raw green part to life is I used, I think, 5 ingredients. Patchouli, which is one that's quite common among a lot of people. A lot of people are familiar with it partly because of its occurrence. Patchouli was sort of like a symbolic thing during the hippie 60s. A lot of people wore pure patchouli oil instead of perfume because it was a sort of like a anti-corporate thing to do back then, which is why a lot of people who buy this perfume tend to be men and women of that generation as well. So patchouli has this beautiful dark. My cat is in here. Sorry, we're just gonna have to go through that. And Pixie, my cat's name is Pixie. She's this child. So we use this really dark sort of patchouli oil that is sort of evocative of decaying leaves, and it's got this beautiful sort of heavy woody scent that's very reminiscent of autumn. So I've combined that with that cis-3-hexanol grassy smell that we were talking about before, and then added in a really interesting smell of tomato leaf, which is so interesting because it's sort of the smell of tomato leaf, which is something that everyone is at least capable of experiencing, and is very, it's a familiar smell if you really think about it. It's incredibly reminiscent of most people's kitchen at one time or another of the year. And it has this beautiful smell of nightshade as well, which is a poisonous plant, I think. But you get this beautiful kind of dark herbal scent that's sort of, reminiscent of a really unripe tomato, which is strange to explain, but it's very beautiful and a kind of childlike scent. So I mixed that with a couple of different watery oceanic smells, one called geosmin, not jasmine, G-O-S-M-N-I-N, yeah, which has that beautiful sort of watery earth smell. And so you get this really dark green effect. When we try to achieve something like this in perfume, or when I'm going about it, the way that I tend to work is, if I'm, say, trying to express a particular scent, trying to express some kind of theme through a scent, I will kind of cast this creative net that will encapsulate many different kinds of smells. Like sometimes it'll be up to 50 ingredients, individual parts to a particular idea I'm working on, and from that I will piece together how the thing I'm trying to describe will potentially work as something that lives in a bottle. And through that process, and through what I call drafting the idea, which is essentially the process where you make many versions and iterations of the scent, through that process you get closer and closer to what you're looking for. Now what's interesting about that is that quite often you won't actually pick the final version for a scent based on, you create 15 versions of something, you pick the 15th. It's often not like that. Sometimes I'll create 30 to 40 versions and I'll pick the 10th. The question that arises from that is, why create so many versions? Part of that is because the process isn't linear. It's not as if every single version is obviously better. You're exploring. There's no, when you're really exploring something, its destination becomes less a result, becomes kind of a secondary result or a byproduct of the exploration rather than its purpose, which is hard for a lot of people to I think, get their noggins around, because of how sort of we learn in very linear ways often. It's clear to talk about that like in that way, but a lot of the time with perfume you're just searching and making these versions and numbering them as you go. As a result, I have like thousands of bottles in my little apartment, and it's quite a mess and hard to organize some of it. So with that being said, I think we'll go back to the painting, and so I always start with the heart note, because it's sort of as if you're creating, if you use music as an example, which I do often, it's like you're building the foundational chords of the song, or you're building the main lyrical hook for the chorus. In a perfume like Ira, we have a really interesting sort of well, in all perfumes, inside the heart note is something called an accord, which is sort of explained a lot in perfume, but the basic idea of it is that you have two ingredients, two smells, and you contrast them together in a way that then sort of fans out, like a sort of like the wake of a boat, fans out for the rest of the perfume. It's the cornerstone of the perfume. So in that sense, the cornerstone of this perfume is sort of a mixture between that patchouli and that grass note. I like to experiment with how accords work though, and we'll sometimes maybe throw in a number of different accords in the heart note, or maybe there isn't quite one accord. It's more of a sort of sum of the greater than the sum of its parts sort of effect, rather than two distinct ingredients leading the way in the whole perfume. Ira is very hard for me to talk about. If any of you get a chance to click on that link that I put in the comments and read its description, its description is really, really quite accurate, because it is a perfume, sort of starts where it ends and finishes where it starts. There are parts of it that almost, when I go back and have to recreate it, it sort of, for batches and for bottling purposes, it's quite a tricky thing, because it seems to not have one obvious center, which is, for a perfume, very, very strange and frustrating, but very beautiful. I think it's one of the reasons why I like it and why people like it. Anyway, moving on. So this white section underneath the green, kind of circling the green, is my top note, if I'm just going to use the analogy sort of in a hardcore way. This was really interesting. I sort of evoked this white part by using Lily of the Valley, which is a really interesting kind of subtle, gentle flower that to me smells very white. And I combined that with a white grapefruit note, so you get this, again, white on white, and then fed in quite a lot of white pepper. So not that many people know this, but there are, I think, at least 4 distinct kinds of pepper: black, white, pink, and green. So I use white pepper in this perfume, and it tends to give it that kind of a kind of really interesting warmth that's very different. In the description of Ira, I use the word pristine brightness to describe this white effect, which is quite different. It's almost sort of clean, but not quite, and it has this kind of sharp clarity and crispness to this whiteness. And obviously, as a result of that, you get this contrast between the 2 layers in a really interesting way. Then moving through that, we have the bottom section, which is this pale it's almost pastel yellow sort of idea, where I've used Ylang Ylang, which is I'm going to put this down for a second, my arm's getting sore, which is like a tropical flower. It tends to be made, grown and harvested a lot in Madagascar. And it has this beautiful sort of, as a synesthetic smell, so as a smell that has distinct colors for me, it has this beautiful kind of sun-like yellow quality with a bit of green and white mixed in as I smell it. And so I've layered that tropical floral scent that's quite intense with neroli, which is essentially an orange, essentially the flower of an orange tree, the distilled essence of an orange flower, and which has a real crisp, more gentle citrusy scent. Mixing that in with something else that I use a lot called mimosa, which I think is actually an Italian forestry term that just means acacia flower. I use it a lot in Pixie. No. I use it a lot in the Portraits of My Birthplace set. So the final section of it, its base note, is essentially that framing part of the painting that I was explaining before. This sort of darkening ochre sort of brown part. So I used sandalwood, which is my sandalwood comes from southern India, and combined that with 2 different moss scents that tend to not be used much in perfume anymore. They're sort of are going out of almost an extinct ingredient in perfume now, and sort of blended that together with a couple of other sort of dry woody notes. And so what you end up with is the moss in Ira, in my perfume that based on the painting, is essentially helping to darken and almost blacken this green heart note, because the green of this heart note doesn't quite go into black. It's nearly there, but when you add a bit of moss to me tends to smell quite black when you get its purest form. So that is Ira in a very sort of conglomerated way of explaining. And I think it's a tricky perfume to talk about in a lot of ways. It's got a lot of differing parts, and kind of it's a bit of a fractal perfume, because there are smaller sections that play smaller roles in the perfumes, like that little white outline of the green section, that mirror and mimic patterns that are happening in a wider part of the perfume. There are bits of it that seem almost as if they improvise inside in little ways and then in larger ways, and they seem to go inside themselves and encircle different parts of the perfume, which is a very interesting and confusing thing to think about for me. It's a little bit like a labyrinth, which is a great movie. I rewatched that the other day, and I think I'm going to try and go through the first Rothko perfume that I did, Black and Deep Red, now. It would be really good to finish the Rothko series off today so that I can move on to something different next week, which I think will be really exciting. So I'm going to link the description where you can see the full write-up of my Black and Deep Red, which is this one that we're going to talk about now. So if you want to click on the links that I've added there under Ira, but I also do have a printout of the painting, which is really exciting. So Black and Deep Red was the first time I ever worked with what I like to call sort of the 5 or 6 really, really big, important rose oils. And it's obvious when you look at a painting like this, how something like red can be evoked through something like a rose. I use one of the sort of the biggest parts of the perfume for me is this perfume represents a kind of awakening in me that happened as I worked with a rose oil from Bulgaria, which is a really, really pivotal part of sort of ancient Middle Eastern perfume. It's not a big thing anymore in a lot of the perfumes that we're used to from a commercial standpoint because it's too expensive and quite a as a rose. I don't know if it's super easy to harvest. I think you need something around 40,000 roses for about a kilo of its oil. That could be quite wrong. I think that's roughly the ratio though. So if you just think about how much that takes in terms of, and a lot of the places that make this essence still do it all by hand. So if you think about that, you start to get a bit of a picture. So the heart note of my perfume is essentially this big black section with the black section on the top. I remember when I was making its mind map, I was, which is something I do before virtually every perfume that I make, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about next week. I was using words like void and death and sort of sparse and intensity, and it was such an interesting experience to see how you could make a perfume answering to nothing other than color. It's what really runs through the entire heart of the Rothko series, which is, I think, as a series, something that I, at least personally, I hope other people do as well, I at least personally think is at the cornerstone of what I do as a creative person. I can always reference back to the Rothko series, which is special to me. And so I had this problem. How do I make what does black smell like? Which is, I don't think, a question that many people answer or ask often of themselves or of their loved ones. But that is how I spent most of the end of 2016. And I ended up working with a lot of different dirty animalic meaning of sort of smelling like animals or beasts, and lots of sort of experimental smells and working with different dark woody extracts. And I ended up coming up with a very, very simple idea, which is, again, the accord or the heart of this scent, which is just a sort of a mixture of peppery, spicy notes with a synthetic reproduction of something called agar wood, or oud, which is its sort of Middle Eastern name. So it's sort of an interesting way of communicating something that was quite complex. You know, the color black is something that I think more or less in every culture is something that is viewed with considerable power, and to express that with simply just more or less 2 ingredients, which is what the heart note is for Black and Deep Red, was a real interesting challenge. It's an incredibly powerful way of starting the perfume. At the time that I was making this 4 years ago, I had more or less never heard of a fragrance that had no heart note, it had a heart note that had no florals or traditional spices, or that was really just a woody ingredient with pepper. I think a lot of people, when they encounter Black and Deep Red, and I should also say from 2018 to last year, Black and Deep Red was, I think, my most popular by a pretty big margin, which is very surprising because when I made it originally, it was, even for me, I think I found it really kind of outrageous and in the best kind of way. But something that's so interesting about the place that black pepper takes with Black and Deep Red is that it takes on this idea of taking things that are absolutely everyday, that are so familiar. I mean, no one at all is not. I think most people can bring a little image of what pepper feels like when you encounter it. Maybe you can't bring up the smell of it exactly, which is something that does take some time and some work with perfume. But it's something that's so common and honestly costs so little now that to take it out of that context and then to use it in something like a fine fragrance or an experimental perfume that Black and Deep Red really is, it makes people kind of tilt their head a little bit. It's like that small opening of the doors of perception. And they go, wow, I didn't think that pepper could say that, which is a really good thing, I think. So moving forward with that, the rest of the perfume is about really contrasting the black heart note with the other darker sort of deep red going into almost a kind of like different kind of gestural pinks in a way. And I think the best way to explain it is to show you this sort of bottom kind of shape here, which is sort of a very dark kind of rosy red that is outlined. There's a little outline there that is like a lighter, kind of like a lighter red, I suppose. Hard to describe color. And then the painting is sort of finished with this this backdrop of really, really dark, almost a kind of blood, almost like the kind of color that blood makes when it dries. And so I've sort of combined, again, a lot of these are very evocative because of how easily we describe their color, but I use things like pink pepper. Pepper's getting a big shout out today. Use things like pink pepper, which is from the Himalayas. No, from the Andes in Peru, sorry. And mix that with pink grapefruit and a few other notes like iris root, which has this sort of dark, lush purple, almost violety scent. And putting that together with a number of my favorite sort of wood elements at the time. The painting is an incredibly intense and heavy thing to really engage with emotionally, I think. And so combining really rare woody scents like my kind of classic go-to cedarwood oil is this Virginian cedarwood, which has that beautiful sort of the smell of a really old chair kind of idea. I use that as the main component in this jazz perfume that I used a lot of when I was doing these live scented sound shows. And the perfume is sort of finished with an oil that I always struggle to say its name. It's something along the lines of guaiac wood, or yeah, I think it's like guaiac wood, which has this amazing burnt, sort of dark rose scent. To me, guaiac wood sort of smells like someone has married a bonfire with a rose in an interesting way. And then I think when you combine all those together, you end up with this incredibly sharp contrast, as if it's sort of um, night and day. It's one of the heaviest scents that I've ever made, and quite a complicated sort of structural thing, because you have different layers of the scent describing wildly different things, and at the same time there are also parts that reference each other. So you have the lighter pink grapefruit idea with the pink pepper. It's sort of mimicking or expressing a lighter shade of that dark rose note that we were talking about earlier, again with the wood. It's one of those perfumes as well that after a little while, it's not okay to talk about it in a linear way, because every part of it, it speaks as if it's a cyclical thing. Some of these perfumes that I make, they don't go like, ta-da, here's your opening note, and in 4 hours you'll get this. Some of it is, its tension and release is very much a result of the perfume's individual unique characteristic, and almost as if it has its own kind of life force, its kind of will. I think, with that being said, we're about 45 minutes in. I'm going to let anyone ask any questions, or if you're watching this in the coming months of sort of after these scent talks are finished, feel free to leave any comments or questions you have, and thank you so much for watching. Sorry about the technical hiccup at the start. If you had to watch the beginning twice, thank you very much for doing that. And I think that will be it for today. Oh, yep. Yeah, cool. Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a very nice week. I'll see you again at 4 o'clock next time. We might be doing it from my personal page. I'm not sure. We'll just figure it out. And yeah, great. I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys. Bye.